You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Francey Hakes, host of Best Case, Worst Case, and a former state and federal prosecutor. Francey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Can you start by telling us about your personal and professional background, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up here just outside of Atlanta in a small bedroom community of Atlanta called Marietta. And I was fortunate to go to the same school system my entire life, pretty much through first through 12th grade. And then I went to the University of Georgia and I graduated from there with a degree in political science. And I went on to law school and graduated from Ohio Northern University Law School and became a prosecutor. I became an assistant district attorney in 1996. And I worked as an assistant DA for 6 years in three different offices actually here in Georgia. Mostly I specialized in crimes against children, but I did a variety of different crime types. And then I got a job with the United States Attorney's Office in what's called the Northern District of Georgia, also known as Atlanta, and became a federal prosecutor, which was a huge dream of mine. I worked on national security cases and crimes against children cases. I got to do a couple of what they call special details to Washington, D.C. One where I worked on FISA warrants. That's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrants, doing counterterrorism and counter-espionage work with all the various agencies of the government in front of the FISA court at the Department of Justice. And then the second time I went up to Washington, I was there for almost 3 years doing a couple of specialized details that focused on protecting children from child exploitation. And I got to do all kinds of really exciting, rewarding things. I got to brief the White House. I got to testify before Congress. I got to testify before the United States Sentencing Commission. I traveled all over the world doing liaison work. I helped write the first national strategy for child exploitation prevention and interdiction in the world for the United States of America, which was published to Congress in 2010. I left the Department of Justice in 2012, and now I work in Hollywood for a production company. I still do a little teaching and training. I'm speaking, as a matter of fact, coming up over in the UK in November. I'll be speaking to a male survivor conference. So I still do a fair bit of that, but mostly I work for a production company called XG Productions, and we produce audio documentaries. We produce television like America's Most Wanted. We produce scripted television, and we're working on movies. So my career has definitely taken a change for sure.
In full disclosure, XG Productions co-produced the series on the Colonial Parkway Murders, which Oxygen decided to call the Lover's Lane Murders a couple of years ago with
That's
Jim
right.
Clemente and many of the people that work on your team now on the audio and television and film projects that you're working on.
I remember that. I was at the company then when that was going on. I wasn't involved in particular with Lover's Lane Murders, which was not the name that we all wanted. Just to be clear,
well.
That was not our idea.
We didn't get a vote.
No. And that's what I'm finding out, that just like government, nothing you do is really yours. And if once you sell something to whoever the buyer or the network is, they really decide everything after that, and you just have to go along.
I found that the folks that write the checks, which in this example is NBC Universal, and they own Oxygen, they're basically in the driver's seat. And the rest of us can fight for our perspective and try to make sure that the points of view that you wanted to get into the program are there. But at the end of the day, you're not really in the driver's seat.
No, definitely not in the driver's seat. I'm not sure you're even in the car.
At best, maybe you're in the back of the bus.
No, I feel like you're running along behind the car, flailing your arms around, begging them to stop and listen to you. But that's just me.
I had a similar experience, I would say. So did you always want to be a prosecutor?
I did. When I was 5 years old, my dad and I used to watch reruns of Perry Mason. And I always wanted to be Hamilton Berger, who was the prosecutor on the show. Because to me, he was the exciting character. He was the one trying to put the bad guys in jail. It was really just his misfortune that he never, ever seemed to have a bad guy to put in jail. It seemed he always got the wrong person. But when the right person was found by Perry Mason, Hamilton Berger always admitted, oh, I guess we got the wrong guy. Judge, arrest that other person. So for some reason at 5, it really made an impression on me. And yeah, I always wanted to be a prosecutor.
What would you say is like the most fulfilling or the most rewarding aspect of being a prosecutor? Like at the end of the day, what was your, I'm going back tomorrow and doing this again?
Of course, dealing with victims is a very special and difficult thing. So I would have to say that dealing with victims was, I'm not sure you can really call that a favorite thing because they're victims of crime. They've been through something terrible. And for some of the victims, something really horrifying. And so while that's very difficult, it can be very rewarding. Mm-hmm. Although there's a tremendous amount of pressure, at least that's what I put on myself, a tremendous amount of pressure to try to find a way to see that the person who'd hurt them was brought to justice. And just like with Hollywood, it's something that you're not really in the driver's seat of because you have to convince a jury, occasionally a judge, but most of the time you have to convince a jury of something that you know in your heart happened and is true. You have to convince them, though, using the rules of evidence and calling witnesses and making arguments. You have to convince 12 people, all 12 people, to agree that this one event happened. And I think that the courtroom was really my happy place. That was where I really loved to be. It was my office. That's where I felt the most at home. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie. It's called From the Hills, starring Judd Nelson way back in the day. I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. In that movie, Judd Nelson, he's not a prosecutor, he's a civil attorney, but he became a lawyer because he wants to go to court. And he's at this big law firm and he's like a junior associate. And so he never gets in the courtroom. And he's giving this speech once to his friends about how he just wants to get in the courtroom. He wants to bang on the tables. He wants to do something exciting. He wants to object. And it's all very dramatic. And then he finally gets a chance to do it. And that's really, for me, banging on the tables and throwing things in court. I guess you could say I channeled my inner drama queen pretty much every time I ever went into court, and it would be true. But I think that was the most rewarding thing, was convincing a jury that the guy in the dock deserved to go to jail. So that made me happy.
I love that.
What's the introduction? I know you were a state's attorney and then a federal attorney. What's the introduction that you say when you first start? Do you say you represent the United States of America?
Yeah, when you stand up in state court here in Georgia, every state, of course, is different. You have to tell the court who you are and who you represent. And I would say Francey Hakes for the state. But when I got to the federal prosecutor's office, I was thrilled to stand up and say Francey Hakes for the United States. I still get chills when I say it.
Wow.
I miss it every day. I miss being able to say Francey Hakes for the United States, but it was definitely a thrill and a real privilege to be able to do it for as long as I did.
Yeah, I'll second Kristin's wow. I can't.
Cool.
The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I mean, that you're representing the country and the people who live here.
It's a very sobering thing when it happens. It's thrilling, but also you feel the weight of it because there is a lot of power. Prosecutors have a lot of power, and it's a weighty thing that you have to take really seriously.
So, Francey, the place where a lot of our listeners may best know you from is your podcast, Best Case, Worst Case, with my favorite person, Jim Clemente. I know sometimes you guys have a little bit of a contentious relationship.
We clash a little occasionally.
I adore Jim. Probably a Jim fangirl. It's probably better that he doesn't know that.
Well, he's going to know it now.
He's going to know it now, yeah. Unless Bill takes it out, which I may ask him to.
That's it. It's in, baby.
Fantastic. So talk to us a little bit about how you formed that partnership with Jim for Best Case, Worst Case. And you guys have been on the air for, 4 years now?
Since 2017.
Oh, wow. So longer than that.
Yeah, a long time. So When I left the Department of Justice, Jim and I had crossed paths. We'd been at training events together. We'd never worked together, but we'd been at training events together. And he left the FBI in somewhere around, I want to say 2008 or 9. I think that's right. And I left in 2012. And it was probably 2013 or 2014 when I reached out to Jim on LinkedIn and just said, hey, what are you up to? Here's what I'm doing. Let's get together sometime. Because after you leave the government, you no longer have all your numbers. So the way that you connect with people is LinkedIn. He responded and said, hey, I'm coming through Atlanta next week. Let's have dinner. So we did. And he told me that he had some work he was doing and he wondered if I could help him. And so I started reviewing stuff and doing a little bit of expert witness work with him. And then things at the production company really started picking up. And he said, I'd really like you to help me at the production company. But first, I have an idea for a new podcast. And I said, what's a podcast? I had absolutely no idea. At that point, he had Real Crime Profile. It was already up and running and had been up for maybe a year, but I still had no idea what a podcast was. So he explained to me what a podcast was. And he said he had an idea for one called Best Case, Worst Case, and he was looking for a co-host. He thought I'd be perfect. And I was like, you mean we're just going to sit and talk and people are going to listen to us? And he said, yes, that's exactly what's going to happen.
Kind of, sort of.
And I said, no visuals, nothing, just talking. I just really had a hard time with the whole concept of the podcast. And so I remember very clearly because it was February of when was the first CrimeCon? Actually, 2017, I think. It was February of 2017 when Jim said, come out to my house. Let's record let's go put in the bank like 8 episodes of Best Case, Worst Case, and we'll launch it at CrimeCon. And I was going to go with them to CrimeCon. That was that June of 2017.
So is that the first one in Indianapolis?
Yes.
Got it.
I remember seeing you in Nashville. I do remember that one.
That was the second CrimeCon.
That was the second one, yes.
Yeah.
But I remember talking to Jim about the fact that you guys were going to the first CrimeCon.
Yes.
And of course, the question at that time was, what's CrimeCon too?
Exactly.
So you took the podcast and launched at CrimeCon.
We did. In fact, we launched the first 2 episodes on the first day of CrimeCon. And I think it might have been something like the second day when we did a live podcast recording. And that ended up, we dropped it as, even though we'd already recorded 8, we dropped it as episode 3. And it was our interview with Bobby Chacon.
Oh, wow.
That's right. With Bobby Chacon talking about his experience on 9/11. So our very first episode was one of my very first cases as a prosecutor, the Watson case in the DA's office in Columbus, a terrible child abuse case. Our second podcast was a case of Jim's. And then our third recorded live at CrimeCon with live questions and everything was with Bobby Chacon talking about 9/11. And I think we're over 300 and something episodes now.
Yes.
Wow.
Right?
Now, what was the atmosphere like? You were still smoothing out your thing, I would imagine, with Jim by that point. And then you decide to go to a live event and have Bobby Chacon join you.
Yeah.
Did the dynamic feel really different? Was there a live audience?
There was a live audience. There were probably 150 people in the room, I think.
Wow.
What did it feel like doing that as opposed to going to Jim's house and knocking out 8 episodes?
Yeah, that was a lot different. Listen, I've been public speaking my whole career. So public speaking doesn't scare me. That doesn't mean I don't get anxious, but it doesn't scare me. But it was a weird thing to think that we're going to sit on a stage at a table with microphones and interview Bobby in front of people. And I just could not wrap my mind around, why are people interested in this? I just don't understand. It just seemed really weird. But that first episode of Best Case, Worst Case right now has something like 180,000 downloads.
Wow.
We're well over 14 million total downloads now.
And crazy.
I still, to this day, I have to admit, it's still super bizarre to me that people want to listen to anything that I say.
Millions and millions
weird.
Of times, too.
Yeah, it seems weird. It does. It does seem super weird to me. I'm humbled by it. I'm excited about it. I love talking. First, I'm a Southern woman, so of course I like talking. But secondly, I'm a born prosecutor, so I love talking. And mostly, I love talking about crime.
Yeah.
I love the podcast because I like interviewing people about their cases. I think it's interesting. I find crime, of course, it was my whole career and still is to this day. So crime to me is fascinating and humanizing the people behind some of these incredible cases. But was Jim's original goal, and then of course mine when I joined on, to humanize the work of law enforcement who are doing really incredible, difficult, terrible things. I tell people I used to think that the hardest thing I would ever have to do would be to sit in my office and listen to a child tell me about the sex abuse that they had suffered. And that was horrible. That was a horrible thing to go through time and time again. But it was worse. It was far worse when I had to look at child pornography as a federal prosecutor, because you're not listening to a child tell you what happened. You're watching it happen.
Oh my gosh.
And it's horrendous. And it's just in your head. And these images are just horrifying. You see just the things that people will do to little children. Just you can't, you just can't understand it. Like you can almost understand why a drug dealer would shoot another drug dealer over like territory. That makes sense. It's wrong. Clearly, it's evil. I don't mean it's not, but it's understandable at least.
Sure.
But you look at child sexual abuse and you just think to yourself, how is this? How does anyone do this? How is this happening? And so that's definitely the hardest thing I ever had to do. And I think that for me, best case, worst case is a way, and every time I speak to people, is a way to remind the citizens that there are people who are sitting behind a desk right now for every hour, every minute of every day, doing that work, suffering that secondary trauma because they want to put the bad guys in jail. Right now, it's not very fashionable to talk about putting the bad guys in jail because it's much more fashionable to talk about letting the bad guys out of jail. I'm against it. I am just against it. I don't think that makes me very politically correct right now, but I will always be for the victims and always be against the bad guys. And I'm someone who thinks that child sex offenders should never get out of jail. There is not enough time that you can spend in jail. I don't care what happens to you in there as far as, oh, you're redeemed. Fine, redeem yourself and sit in prison. To me, that's just what I believe.
Yep.
But so that's an important message that I try to convey, I think.
Are there places in the trajectory of best case, worst case that are still difficult? In other words, I was thinking about even the example you brought up a moment ago, Francey. It's you and Jim and Bobby Chacon talking about Bobby's experiences on 9/11. And we interviewed Bobby about 9/11. And as a former New Yorker who was living in New York on 9/11, he was such a great storyteller. But I found myself drawn into and going through some of the same emotion we all felt that day. So the topics are very serious. Is it sometimes a struggle to talk about these things with people that they lived them, they investigated, they prosecuted, they did something that's very difficult work? Is it hard for you and them to revisit?
Yeah, sometimes I think it is, although I think one of the things I learned from some of the people who do counseling for first responders is that sharing the trauma lessens it. Sharing it makes it just a tiny bit better. And I think that's what a lot of people find when they come in and talk about their cases. So I've talked about some of my cases. Jim will interview me about some of my cases occasionally. And you do find that you feel emotional when it's appropriate to feel emotional, because you don't have, I think for me, I don't really quite have that barrier I used to. Like when I look back and think about what I used to do for a living and how difficult it was to look at child pornography and to prosecute these cases and have to deal with that kind of just the vile dregs of humanity. It's like I feel like it steals a little piece of your soul, or maybe I felt like it blackens a little piece of your soul where you just can't really get that off. It's like smut that you can't get rid of because it just stains you. It stains you. And I think you have a bit of a shield when you're doing the work, or you couldn't do the work. And I don't have a shield anymore. Sometimes talking to people about it, or even revisiting my own cases in my own mind, are much more difficult and much more raw now than they were then. So yeah, sometimes, Bill, I think they do awaken that difficult to deal with kind of emotion.
You guys have done some amazing work over the last couple of years with Audible presentations at XG. Everything that you guys have done, I've listened to multiple times and I have loved.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's so nice of you to say.
And I finished listening to Midwest Monster the other day, which is your newest. That was difficult to listen to, but boy, it is worthwhile to listen to. So for anybody who may not be familiar with the Kansas College Rapist, which is the case which is the basis for Midwest Monster, can you just give us a quick thumbnail sketch of the Kansas College Rapist?
Of course, I certainly would encourage anyone who wants to know more about this case to go to audible.com and look up Midwest Monster and listen for yourself. It's about 2.5, 3 hours. It's an incredible case that started a couple of decades ago when a young woman on a college campus there in Kansas, there was Kansas State and University of Kansas, and a young woman on one of the campuses had her apartment invaded. She lived just off campus and she had her apartment invaded and she was raped. And it was a brutal attack by a man wearing a mask and gloves and who had shaved all his body hair. He had a gun and he set up a video camera. And after this rape, he made her go to the bathroom and brush her teeth and then flush her toothbrush and then take a shower. And he watched her in the shower so that to make sure she had cleaned all of herself off of any, obviously these were forensic countermeasures before he left. And this serial rapist continued this pattern for years. And the last known attack was in 2015 there in Kansas. And there are a total of 14 or 15 victims. And it's just a horrendous series, but we have 2 of the survivors. I'll call them Abby and Beth because those are the names that we used in the project. Those are not their real names. They are so incredibly brave. I'm still in touch with them today. We text, and they were so brave to come forward and tell their stories in detail, what happened to them. They have not just survived, but thrived in the 2 decades, really, since then. They are incredible young women, Abby and Beth, and I admire them tremendously. And the reason that they agreed to sit and be interviewed for Midwest Monster was in the hopes that something they say, something any of the other people that we interview say might trigger a memory or flag something for someone into recognizing who this offender is, because he is still uncaught. He's not just uncaught, he's unidentified, Kristin. Yeah. And that to me was the biggest reason we wanted to bring this forward. And we had to do some, I had to do in particular some really fancy dancing to the police departments there to get them to talk to us, because it's an unsolved case for 20 years. And they feel responsible for that. They feel horrible that it hasn't been solved yet. And I think they were afraid that we were going to be pointing fingers at them and passing a bad judgment. But it's just a fact that this guy was very forensically sophisticated. Yeah. And they have done just yeoman's work in trying to figure out who this person is. They've done thousands of interviews. They've developed literally over 1,000 different suspects, and it's just not happened yet. They've just not been able to solve the case. And so our hope is that the more people that listen to Midwest Monster, the more people will hear profiler Dr. Mike Burke and the survivors themselves and the other police officers talking about this offender, who he is, who he likely is in his life, what he was doing at these various times that might trigger a partner, a wife, a child, an aunt, a parent to remember something unusual about this offender. So I hope that this project can help identify the Midwest Monster.
The law enforcement people are usually incredibly reluctant to get into any kind of lengthy discussion about an unsolved case. How did you really, I know you said you did some fancy dancing, but usually the answer to questions like that, will you do an interview with us, is just a flat out, no, it's an open case. What do you think was different about it? Was it the team or your approach that allowed them to open up more?
I think, Bill, you're asking me to give away my secrets.
Oh, the trade secrets.
No, I think that's a great question. They did tell me no. They told me no several times.
I figured.
Wow.
I don't take no. That's not really, just ask my dad or my husband. It's not really a word I like to hear. And so I just didn't let it stop me. And I kept asking them. I think the truth of the matter is that I tried very hard my entire career to be a good prosecutor. And I like to think anyway, it's sort of self-congratulatory, but I like to think that I built a very solid reputation as a pro-law enforcement prosecutor. And I'm still a very pro-law enforcement, and I always will be, a person. That doesn't mean I won't call out bad conduct, because I do. But I'm very pro-law enforcement as a person. And I think that reputation, I have to say the U.S. Marshals were tremendously helpful. Dr. Mike Burke is a personal friend of mine. and he worked on the case. And so he was able to vouch for me with them and make sure that the police understood that our perspective was not anti-cop, that we weren't there to point fingers, that we honestly and truly wanted to present something to the public that might help solve the case. And ultimately, it's not about me. It's to their credit because they really want to solve the case. They've tried everything, canines, every scientific test you can think of, profiling multiple times, of course, 1 million man hours of interviews and pounding the pavement. And I think they just, in the end, decided that getting a lot more people to listen to the case might help them find a clue that can eventually solve it. They just really want to solve the case.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
So you signed on Paget Brewster, who most people will know is from Criminal Minds. She's my favorite character.
She plays Emily Prentice.
Love her to death. Why was it important to you that she be the storyteller for this piece?
I love her. I think that Paget is first, she's a great actress, of course, but most importantly, she is a lovely human being. And it was a real thrill to me. I got to meet her when Jim and we had her on Best Case, Worst Case. We interviewed her on one of our episodes of Best Case, Worst Case, and we went to her house to do it. And so I actually got to meet her in person. I've got a photograph with her. And by the way, nobody wants to take a picture next to a Hollywood actress. It's not good. Talk about humbling. No matter how good you think you look, you're standing next to an actress and you look crappy. That's a judgy moment for me. But anyway, she was just lovely and friendly and thank me for my service, for goodness sakes. And so when the time came to figure out who we wanted to narrate, on my list was one person, and it was Paget. And of course, she and Jim are longtime friends. And Jim told her about the project and said that I was executive producing and writing it, and would she consider? And she didn't even think twice about it.
Wow.
She said, absolutely, yes.
Oh, so cool.
And so she was just the sweetest thing. And I got to direct her to do the narration. And it was a lovely experience. She is so professional and so good at what she does, not to mention just has a great voice. And I was thrilled that she agreed to do it.
Did you find yourself saying, I'm sorry, Paget, that just wasn't good enough? Could you take that one more time?
Even though I'm a bit of a bull in a china shop, Bill, I do have a bit of a filter as well when necessary. No, you never tell them you don't like it. All you say is, could you do that one more time? And this time, let's try with the emphasis on the end.
There we go.
That's how you do it.
Duly noted. Hey,
but she rarely, I have to admit, she doesn't really need very much direction. She does a ton. She's won awards. She does a ton of voiceover work already. So she was telling me what the best thing was.
On a more serious note, one of the things I think is most chilling about the Kansas College Rapist case are the forensic countermeasures. And you use that expression, which always just chills my bones. What did you make of that when you were looking through the details of the case? How is this rapist understanding all of the steps that he might need to take to try to minimize his exposure from a scientific perspective?
That's a really interesting question, Bill. I have to go back to, as a prosecutor, way back in the day when the television show CSI first came out. Remember, it was set in Vegas. The first crime show that really went in depth into the world of the crime scene technicians, crime scene investigators, as they called it. There was nothing about that show that it was realistic. It was entertaining, but it was complete fiction, just utter bunk. And as a prosecutor, I literally hated it because they would say things on the show like, I can always find DNA. And I'm thinking to myself, I can't. We can't.
Oh, really?
I'm in Georgia. We can't always find DNA. And when we do, we can't test it all. So stop saying things like that to people. Or there's always a fingerprint. No, there's not. No, there's not always a fingerprint. So those kind of generalizations made the consumer who sits on juries absurdly demanding because they wanted things that did not exist. But the other thing that those shows did, I think, is teach. They taught offenders how to evade because they made them see, realistically or unrealistically, what forensics really was and what it was capable of. And now listen, they rarely had anything on there that was completely out of the realm of anything, that is high tech currently available. But those things, I remember one time, this was a long time ago, I remember seeing a scene where they tented it.
Oh, yeah,
and they sprayed that super glue stuff.
Super glue tent rig, yeah.
Nobody had that. That was in like one lab in the country. And it cost an outrageous amount of money. And unless you had a multiple murder scene, you couldn't do it because they were so in demand. You couldn't get it. Your crime lab couldn't afford it. It just was ridiculous. But they were constantly doing that. And so that glue tent and everything made, I think, offenders think that the forensics was going to get them. And so I think people like this Kansas College Rapist understands that forensics would be his downfall. And so he was taking these terribly sophisticated steps to make sure that he left no forensics behind. And that's just a shock, I think, to people to think that a violent rapist could leave no forensic evidence behind, no DNA, no trace, no prints. But that seems to be the case.
One of the things that Midwest Monster got into, actually the two major problems that they got into, is the discussion of reporting rape and then prosecuting rape in America. One of the things that I took away from it is the fact that it is the most massively underreported violent crime. I knew it, but I hated hearing it again. And you spend a lot of time talking about the major problem. Prosecuting it can be due to this concept called statute of limitations that maybe not everybody is familiar with. So can you give a brief rundown of what statutes of limitation are and what does that mean for people who want to hold rapists accountable for their crimes?
Yeah, rape and child sexual abuse are the most underreported crimes in the country. And the estimates of underreporting for rape are around as much as 50%. So that means we're only getting about 50% of reports of women who are being raped, men and women, but mostly women who are being raped. Unfortunately, unlike murder, rape was a crime for a long time that had what's called a statute of limitation. Most cases have what's called a statute of limitation. And that means there is a limit on the time in which a prosecutor is allowed to bring a case. So if in the year 2000, a crime is committed, say it's a bank robbery, a crime is committed and nobody finds the offender, they don't solve the case for 20 years. In the state of Georgia, that's just too late. You needed to solve the crime earlier. And there's a reason for that. It's not a random thing. The reason is because if you haul the defendant into court right now, today in 2022, for a bank robbery that you allege he committed in the year 2000, what is his defense if it's say, oh, I was out of town that day? I couldn't have robbed this bank in downtown Atlanta. I was in Florida on business. It's 22 years ago. Who has records still? Can he prove it? Does anyone even remember? Does he even remember where he was 22 years ago on a specific night? And so the idea of the statute of limitations is really all about fundamental fairness because our system is designed to be fair to the accused because the government has a lot of power. And so the accused needs to be given certain rights so that he can fight the charges meaningfully. And that includes a time limit because witnesses die, paper gets lost, evidence is too old, witnesses' memories are no longer good. And so for all those reasons, we have statutes of limitations for most crimes. We don't have it for murder in any state. And slowly, the states are starting to understand that sexual crimes like rape and child abuse should be in that category. One of the things we found out on Midwest Monster in the state of Kansas, for example, was that for many years until very recently, their statute of limitations for rape was 5 years. So an offender had to be identified and brought into court within 5 years of the offense. So it's not within 5 years of you discovering some new technology or new evidence. No, within 5 years of the crime. And so that caused all sorts of problems. Now, they've extended their statute of limitations now in Kansas, but many other states, I think Hawaii was an example that I looked up when we were getting this whole Midwest Monster into production. Hawaii had a 5 or a 7 year statute of limitations. And so there are still states in this country with relatively short statutes of limitations for rape. And I just think it's terrible because if the offender, like this one in Midwest Monster, if he can stay away long enough, if he can avoid capture long enough, He'll never be held accountable for what he did. And I think that's horrifying.
It seems to take the air out of the excitement that many of us feel. We're seeing forensic genetic genealogy being used to solve so many serious sexual assaults, murders, and so on. But if the statute of limitations has expired, then we're out of luck. Now, obviously, for a murder case, as you said, it doesn't apply. But
Right.
It's so disheartening to find out that we've finally identified a perpetrator, an offender in a terrible series of sexual assaults in this example. It's so heartbreaking to find out that some states haven't found a way to create a longer, appropriate period of.
It's so difficult, Bill, because you've got this balance, right? There has to be balance in the system. You've got to be fair to offenders or to accused. Anyway, I guess they're not an offender until they're convicted, but we have to be fair to the accused. It's one of the reasons we left King George in England way back in the day, because trials were not fair. People were being thrown in prison without knowing the evidence against them or hearing witnesses. They didn't have any right to attorneys and all that stuff. You also have to be fair to victims, but there's no question that in this sort of triad, if you will, the triad between the government, the accused, and the victim just gets completely disregarded in almost every way. Look at the Jeffrey Epstein case, for example.
Yeah.
The federal government, my own brethren in the U.S. Attorney's Office down in South Florida, they had the case and they made a deal with Epstein. They signed a non-prosecution agreement without ever telling the victims. Now, that was completely and 100% in violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, which gives them the right to meaningful consultation with the prosecutor, to notice of anything that's going to dismiss the charges or result in a plea or a trial. But they were completely disregarded. And what is the remedy? Right? So they have these rights, but the rights don't have any teeth, because without teeth, prosecutors, to my shame, can just disregard them. And so victims can be given very short shrift in our system, because it's not victims whose freedom is going to be taken away. It's the accused. And so they have to have rights to fight. They have rights to an attorney and rights to all the evidence. And you can't do trial by ambush. But what about the victim? What right does the victim have? They have rights listed in statute. I'm working on something right now out of California, and there was a serious case of child abuse that went on at a daycare center. And the offender gets arrested, and the child's parents, the child was only 4 years old, and the child's parents were never even contacted and told that the offender is getting out of jail, that he was only held for a couple of days and then gets out. And there they see him. He's wandering around in the community.
Oh, my gosh.
And
Wow.
in California, they have a right to know. They have a right to meaningful consultation. They have a right to know specifically that someone is going to make a bond or someone is going to be released from jail. And they just didn't get any notification. Nobody cared. Why? Because there's no teeth in these provisions. There's no remedy when they're violated. Nobody pays a price. There's not a fine. There's not a suspension. There's nothing for violating victims' rights. We have to do a much better job in this country than we're doing right now.
I would say the strongest component of Midwest Monster for me as a listener is the fact that you have showcased women, and you referred to them earlier as Abby and Beth, who are refusing to let being rape victims ruin their lives. They're discussing how to heal, how to move forward from trauma. What is the message that you want women who have been victims of rape and sexual assault to know about healing from trauma?
That's a great question, Kristin. I think that for me, the most important thing to remember is that you're alive. That's the most important thing. You have survived. You've already survived. To me, what Abby and Beth said is so important: to live your best life. That is the best revenge. You do not want to spend your life thinking about what happened to you, ruminating on it, marinating in it, because who wins? He does.
Yep.
He wins. If that's your attitude going forward. And that was not their attitude. They went back to school. They went right back to the same place in spite of what happened to them there, because they were determined that he not win. And I think that's the best message to survivors: is don't let him win by focusing on it the rest of your life, because you have survived. You can succeed in whatever you want to do because you've survived that. And I think too, I want women to think very long and hard about reporting these sexual assaults. I know what I'm asking. I've had rape cases, lots of rape cases, and they're very difficult cases to prosecute. And you get dragged through the mud. We see it all the time, all over the news. Whenever there's an allegation, especially against a famous person, what's the first thing they do? Is they absolutely start throwing darts at the victim. Yep. She's a slut. She wanted it. It was consent. She likes rough sex, all these different defenses. So yes, it is not going to be an easy time. But I've had children that I've put on the witness stand before that when they testified and pointed out the offender in front of the jury and left the courtroom, and I talked to them later, they looked me in the eye and they said, I saw him and I pointed at him. I did good, didn't I? And they took that little bit of power right back. And I think that holding that guy to account, and frankly, this is going to sound terribly self-defeating, but even if he doesn't get convicted, you have put him through it. You have let him know that you are not going to be quiet, that he did not win, that he did not silence you. And you're going to look him in the eye, by God. Whatever those 12 people do, you can't control. But you can control how you react to it. And you can control that you can face him in the courtroom and make by damn sure that jury's going to know your story and not his.
Did you ever talk about the possibility that this offender in the Midwest Monster series might actually end up listening to the show? The show's incredibly popular. It's on Audible. Many of your other shows have done incredibly well. He could be one of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people listening to the show. Did you ever think to yourself, he might actually hear this?
We did. We talked about it. And I talked about that specifically with Mike Burke and with Abby and Beth, because, of course, that's one of the things they were very concerned about. It's why we used a pseudonym. Those aren't their real names because we want to make sure that they're protected. But Mike Burke thought that there was a real possibility that the offender would hear. And he hopes that listening and hearing Abby and Beth and knowing how much time has passed might inspire this guy to turn himself in. Mike Burke is a great psychologist, and I just think he's a bit of an optimist. I don't feel that optimistic about it. I think this guy is a violent predator, and I can't see him ever admitting his guilt, pleading guilty, or turning himself in. It just doesn't seem that fits to me with the kind of person that he obviously is, the kind of complete and utter scum that he obviously is. So I can't see that happening, but I certainly wish it would. I hope so. I hope he listens and by God turns himself in. But I think it's much more likely that someone who knows him will hear that behavior and what went on in that time frame and in those time periods and where he must have been in order to have access to these young women at these two college campuses in Kansas, and will call the police. And what I think is really likely is that this guy has some kind of a partner, possibly a mother, someone that he lives with, and he's got a storage facility or a locked closet or a drawer that is full of these videos of these horrific rapes.
Oh, I forgot.
Someone
about
has
the
got
videos.
to know that. Yeah. Someone has got to know it. Either they've seen him watching it, or they're living with someone who has a hidden room. I had a case once with an offender who was offending against her from the time she was 5 to the time she was 9. And he had a locked room that his wife wasn't allowed to go in. And I thought to myself, what the hell are you thinking? Why do you think that's okay? Why aren't you weirded out by the fact that your spouse has a locked room you're not allowed to go in? It's not like he's a diamond merchant and you're not allowed to go to where the diamonds are stored. It's crazy. So I think this guy probably has that same kind of thing. And someone who listens to Midwest Monster might think, oh my God, I wonder if that's what he has in that locked room or that locked drawer, that storage facility I'm not allowed to go to.
Francey, this has been an amazing series that you guys have put together for Audible, but I know it's not the only thing you're working on. Can you talk about what's next for you and best case, worst case, and anything else you're doing with XG?
Wow, that's a big ask, Kristin. I really appreciate you guys asking me to come on, and I really appreciate you highlighting Midwest Monster. It's such a passion project for me. It's so important for me. It's almost like I'm still a prosecutor a little bit. I can still feel like I'm seeking justice. And that is what we really do at XG in a lot of ways, is we highlight these kind of projects and we're seeking justice. Some of my favorite projects that we've done that are still, of course, available on Audible are Call Me God. about the DC sniper case. That's just an incredible in-depth perspective from all the people who worked that case that you've never heard of before. Shootout, the battle for North Hollywood.
Oh, yeah, great.
That's an amazing project. We got some incredible interviews of people like the dentist who saved the life of the young rookie police officer who's still a sergeant today at LAPD. That's an amazing project. And we have a lot coming out that I think people will be interested in. Go to xgproductions.com to see. So that's exciting. Of course, we're going to continue best case, worst case. Jim and I have really focused the last couple of weeks on the Eliza Fletcher kidnapping and murder, which is just horrifying, just a terrible case. And Kristin, you mentioned earlier about rape being underreported, something that I would really like to highlight. And we've actually tried to get a variety of different outlets to let us do a show or project about, and everyone always says no, about the rape kit backlog. It's just shocking to me that Eliza Fletcher didn't have to die. That offender should have been behind bars because the woman was raped before Eliza Fletcher was kidnapped, was raped an entire year before that. And it took them almost a year to process that rape kit and to get a result that came in a couple of days after Eliza was dead. And it's how many women have to die? Why do we devalue this so much? It infuriates me that we do this and continue to do it and have plenty of money in this country to fix this problem. We're too busy wasting it on stupid stuff. I would cuss here, but I don't know if you're allowed to cuss in this podcast, so I'm not going to. And so that, I think, is something that we all as podcasters can consistently highlight by covering cases like Eliza Fletcher and talking about rape kit backlog, how inexcusable it is, and how we all should demand it be fixed. We are the taxpayers. We're the citizens. We're providing the money. Where is it going? We need to demand that our politicians prioritize rape kits and DNA like that from every crime because there's no excuse for it. There's no excuse for waiting a year to process it because you are sitting there saying, here's your saying to the woman who gets raped in 2021, you don't matter.
Exactly.
We don't care if that guy's running around raping other women, which means women don't matter. It drives me absolutely up the wall. And so I think as podcasters, we can all agree that those sort of issues are why we do what we do and why it's important to continue to do what we do and hopefully draw the attention of legislators and lawmakers and fix this damn problem once and for all. Oh, I did cuss. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Phenomenal discussion for the next time we have you on Mind Over Murder.
Anytime.
Yes. Francey, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure, and we do hope you'll join us for another episode of Mind Over Murder.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.